Okay, we might make a start of it. So thanks very much, everyone who is joining this session live online through Zoom, and also thanks to everyone who is also watching over YouTube. You're all very welcome to this session, which is going to be looking at exploring GenAI for digital learning tools, ethics, pedagogical possibilities. So I suppose to begin, maybe just something I think which is worth mentioning is that if you are among the many of us who maybe feel some way uncertain around the sudden prevalence of Gen AI tools and commentary around same, I think you're certainly not alone. I think we've all been bombarded with kind of the discussion and the kind of concerns around Gen AI tools which have been kind of emerged over the past year. So if it does feel overwhelming, it I think it generally is, but you're certainly not alone. We're here to try and help guide you through, I suppose, this process. Maybe just a brief mention in terms of the session today is it's certainly not our intention to try and kind of tell anyone what to do in terms of using or not using GenAI tools, in terms of assessment, so on and so forth. This session today is really just designed to try and provide some kind of guidance around considerations and the impact of the technology. If you do have any questions in the session for anybody joining us through Zoom, please do feel free to put them into the Q&A. And for anyone who's joining us over YouTube, please feel free to enter any questions you have into the live chat area. Depending on how many questions there are and how complicated they are, we may not be able to get to all of them, but we will certainly try and answer as many questions as we can at the end of the session. I would note, however, this is not going to be the only TEL session in the whole area of generative AI. So we will be providing additional sessions and additional resources and additional training over the coming semester in this space, but I'll talk more about that as we come across it. So for the session today, what I'm hoping to try and cover is to speak broadly on generative AI and considerations around assessment, around teaching, around learning, by which I mean student use of Gen AI tools. I'd like to talk a small bit just about the potential impact on graduates. I'd like to talk about future issues and impact, ethical issues associated with the technology, and also to talk about further and upcoming supports and resources that the Department of TEL will be rolling out over the coming semester. So I think assessment is worth beginning with because generally research does indicate that assessment is probably the largest concern among most educators when it comes to generative AI tools. There's a broad range of research which would indicate this. Generally, it's felt that that is with good concern. One of the major issues when we talk about generative AI and assessment, and I suppose when I talk about that, I'm primarily talking about the use of Gen AI tools to develop assessment content by students. So when we talk about the use of Gen AI tools for that purpose, one of the major issues that plagiarism detection software, which historically we would have relied on as a way of identifying potential plagiarism, all current kind of and emerging research would indicate that the software that is used for plagiarism detection, things like, for example, Turnitin, Original, Orkun, so on and so forth, is not particularly reliable. Now, there's a broad and growing range of research which would indicate that this software is not sufficient for catching generative AI developed content. There's a number of different reasons for that. We won't get into all of them here, but generally, the availability of Gen AI tools such as ChatGPT, the way in which they work, the features and the kind of practicalities and the ways in which they are used. Generally, they just provide too many obstacles or too many kind of workarounds to tools like Turnitin in the ability of that kind of software to catch content which has been developed using Gen AI. There is also a danger of what's known as false positives, so instances where even though a student might have developed content entirely by themselves, tools like Turnitin or kind of educators themselves incorrectly identify content which has been developed entirely by students as something which has been developed by a tool like ChatGPT. So there's a number of complications and there's a number of considerations in that space, but one main takeaway, I think, is that generally tools like ChatGPT, in terms of their use for assessment, they have eclipsed, or we can no longer effectively rely on tools like Turnitin or similar plagiarism detection software. Now, there are, however, a number of options available to us in this when it comes to managing assessment in AI world, however. So a number of the things that we can do in this space include integration of AI into existing assessment, redesign of certain assessment elements, and also additional activities which we can take when it comes to assessment and generative AI. So some of the one kind of the main ways in which we can try and manage the use of AI in assessment is by simply giving students clear instruction in terms of what we as educators are happy with them to use AI tools for and what we are not happy to use them for. So one such resource which I found particularly useful is the AI assessment scale, which was developed by someone called Leon Furtz. And essentially, as you can see there, all this is really is it is a scale which provides a number of uh, options through which indicate the level of AI that a student may or may not use when working on an assessment. So that ranges from, for example, something like no AI, where a student is not permitted to use any form of generative AI in dealing with an assessment, to AI exploration, which essentially means that the student can use GenAI tools such as ChatGPT in whatever way they want. So seems like a very kind of simple and basic thing, but even presenting something like this when assigning an assessment to students is a way and indicating a point on the scale which you are satisfied for students to adopt can be an extremely useful way of giving students and yourself as well some guidance in terms of what GenAI tools can and cannot be used for. I suppose one kind of small thought experiment that I would have done previously is, as a student, if I were to use ChatGPT to write a version 1 based on a bullet point list as a structure for a report with the intention to write a version 2 entirely myself, there's a question: does that constitute a breach of academic integrity? So if I use GenAI tools in this way, is that or is that not a breach of academic integrity? And I guess the answer to that is essentially it all depends. It all depends what the instructor or the educator communicates to the student in terms of what they can and cannot use AI tools for. So a really critical element, I think, and something which a tool like this is quite useful for, is very simply giving students additional direction and guidance in terms of what they can and cannot use AI for when it comes to assessment development. And indicating something like this to them does help clarify the whether the use of these tools are acceptable or not acceptable, and what they are and are not acceptable for. There are a number of additional options that can also be undertaken when it comes to assessment redesign. Now, when we talk about assessment redesign, I don't think that necessarily means that we need to go out and we need to redevelop all of our assessment types from scratch. Mulder et al. Have identified that there's a number of different kind of I suppose, minor elements or adjustments that we can make to assessments that can help to overcome or to avoid instances of students using tools like ChatGPT to develop assessment material. So shifting the emphasis from assessing the overall process of assessment and development as opposed to the end product that they end up, incorporating tasks that ask students to demonstrate evaluative judgment, designing nested or staged assessments, diversifying assessments formats, incorporating more authentic, context-specific or personal assignments, more in-class and group assignments, and even things like oral activities are all ways of helping to overcome the use of GenAI tools for assessment development. Something to be conscious of with this is that research has indicated that there are certain elements that tools like ChatGPT do not do particularly well. Broadly speaking, ChatGPT and similar tools can be relatively hard to spot when it comes to what we refer to as textbook problems. They do far less with what are referred to as authentic problems, and very often authentic problems would incorporate things like critical thinking, originality, personal experience, so on and so forth. Working with real world data is a big element there as well. So broadly thinking about assessments, if we can look at incorporating more elements related to authentic problems into our assessment design, that is a very useful way of limiting the effect or the opportunity uh, in how students can use tools like ChatGPT for content development. A very effective tool as well, which can be added onto existing assessments without the need for a full assessment redesign, are things like rubrics. So rubrics do not require that we necessarily have to completely redevelop the assessment brief or the manner of the assessment. It's just a way of orientating, I suppose, the marking scheme and how we score assessments. And again, incorporating rubrics which lean more towards, some of the elements mentioned there associated with authentic problems, critical thinking, personal experience, so on and so forth. Developing rubrics and marking schemes which kind of orient more towards that are a way of limiting the potential use of ChatGPT by students to complete reports comprehensively, and just kind of limit the degree to which they can be, uh, you know, deployed immediately as a to develop assessment content. Additional activities which can be useful for assessments, and these are generally just kind of practical kind of suggestions as opposed to anything else. But these would include things like stress testing assessment yourself. So very simply, using a tool such as ChatGPT to try and develop an answer for an assessment which you've developed, and seeing how accurate or how effective, or I suppose how hard to spot the response which you get from a tool like ChatGPT gives when you're developing a response to assessment created. Assessment process tracking is something that I think we mentioned before, but breaking up assessment elements over a longer period with each submission building on a previous. So where possible, what that would involve is it would involve, for example, instead of student handing up a final report at the end of a semester, we might ask them and assign a certain amount of marks towards them submitting a first draft, maybe another number of marks towards a second draft in the middle of the semester before handing up the final draft. And the idea with that approach as well is that the second draft should build on the first draft, the final submission should build on the second draft, so on and so forth. So each submission builds upon the previous kind of submission. Additional element which can be useful is the use of real world data. So generative AI tools generally, they tend not to work particularly well with kind of when real world data is involved. So something which we would have done previously in kind of, for example, the masters in e-learning, would be the use of real world data in assessment. Very often this can take the form of a menu. So you give students 2 or 3 choices in terms of real world situations that they have to base their assessments on, and students pick from those and develop kind of using those. There is also the opportunity when we talk about assessment and generative AI to move towards high stakes terminal assessment. So things like, for example, exam halls and similar. Certainly, and again, we're not kind of we certainly have no interest in attempting to tell anyone how to run their assessments, but certain considerations I think when it comes to this is that generally that is a move. Approaches like that are a move away from what we'd refer to as authentic assessment, which is, I suppose, based on the diagram developed there by the National Forum for Teaching and Learning. Authentic assessment, I guess, to a certain degree, represents the ultimate expression of assessment, and generally, kind of terminal high stakes exam tend to be something of a move away from that. Now, just returning to the notion of plagiarism detection software, something that I would like to highlight is that the Department of TEL and our colleagues Edsu and Kerry are intending to do a closed pilot for an AI detection feature in Turnitin over the coming semester. So there is an AI detection feature available within Turnitin, and what we would hope to do over the coming semester is to try and actually test this out through a closed group pilot. What we'll be doing is we'll be asking for volunteers from MTU staff to engage in this process over the coming semester. So there will be communications going out around that, and we would really welcome people's input and their involvement in that process. That's very much an attempt to, I suppose, determine the effectiveness, the limitations of tools like this ourselves as a university. So that is something there, as I said, there's going to be a range of different activities related to GenAI that the Department of Tel will be engaging with over the coming semester, but this is going to be a big one. And we'll be sending out additional communications and information and updates around that over the next number of weeks. So another use or another consideration in terms of GenAI tools relates to teaching. And I suppose when I say teaching, what I'm primarily referring to is the use of GenAI tools by educators and instructors such as yourselves. So there's a broad range of research which has been conducted in terms of how GenAI tools are used by educators in higher education. Generally, research would indicate that among the most common application of GenAI tools in teaching is the use of GenAI tools for content and lesson development, for lesson planning or making suggestions around planning of lessons, for marking and feedback, for translation, and also for communicating. Generally, that same research would indicate that most educators use open and available tools such as ChatGPT, and generally these tend to be self-initiated by individuals. So there isn't much evidence of, I suppose, university-led or school-led initiatives. These, or the research would indicate that these tend to be people going off and kind of engaging with these tools themselves on their own time and in their own way. Similarly, barriers to the use of GenAI tools for teaching research would indicate that, excuse me, the most common barriers among teaching staff relate to lack of understanding and knowledge of the tools, identified risks associated with using those systems, fears around incorrect content being provided, concerns around bias, restricted availability, and also in some instances where these are not applicable to practice. Now, we have a number of GenAI tools that we can speak about. I would emphasize, please do not take these as recommendations from us. So these are some of the more popular tools, some of the more interesting tools, some of the tools which we in Tel have had some experience with, or I guess like ourselves. But nothing that we mentioned here is meant to be an official recommendation. They're just initial suggestions that if you're interested in this space, you could engage with these tools and see whether they would be effective for your purposes. So as I mentioned, please don't take any of this as any form of official recommendation. It's just some initial tools that you might engage with to get started. So generally tools for text generation, data gathering, and analysis, they tend to, those kind of functions, they tend to kind of be present within kind of the one tool. The big one, or certainly one of the most popular ones and one of the most well-known ones, is obviously ChatGPT. In addition to ChatGPT, there is a similar system called Claude. Claude uses a similar approach to ChatGPT, but it uses what's known as this constitutional AI system. It's essentially kind of developed using both supervised learning and reinforcement learning, and it's generally designed to do less harm. Copilot is a similar feature, again, to Claude and to ChatGPT. That is available to all staff within NTU as part of the Office 365 suite. In addition, there is also Perplexity. So that's an AI-powered search engine. It's basically an AI chatbot that cites where it gets its answers from, unlike tools like ChatGPT. And sorry, something that I meant to mention as well, if anybody does have any GenAI tools that they are aware of or that they've used themselves or that they themselves would recommend, please do put them into the Q&A as we're going through. And I see as well, Selena, that there is a question in there. So if it's okay with you, just because there's a lot to get through, I'm going to come back to all of the questions at the end of the session. But if anybody does have any questions, any recommendations, comments, so on and so forth, please do feel free to enter them into the Q&A in Zoom. In terms of GenAI tools that can be used for media generation, again, just some of the more common or some of the more popular ones. We tend to use the Adobe Creative Suite ourselves quite a bit here in the Department of Tel. So Adobe Firefly is the GenAI content development tool, which can be used for developing media. Similarly, Midjourney and DALL-E are extremely popular GenAI image development tools. DALL-E now is integrated into ChatGPT. There is also a Google LLM called Notebook. The idea with Notebook is that it can be used to develop a kind of AI kind of generated podcast. So that's an interesting tool. It can be used, I guess, as a way of developing learning kind of on the go learning resources. Um, Editing features in it are limited, however, so there is an additional tool called JellyPod, which allows for greater granularity in creating AI generated podcasts, but JellyPod allows for greater editing, greater kind of granularity in terms of content. Additional Gen AI tools then include things like Scholarly, which is an AI powered kind of system for helping to analyze and identify and organize academic papers. There is also Glean, which is a pretty popular tool for developing chatbot support as well. Now, as I mentioned, all of the resources which are I've mentioned there, none of those are recommendations. They're just initial kind of tools that you could engage with to begin the process of testing them out. Something certainly which I would say is that in general, be led by your need as opposed to a technology. So there is none of these tools, I would think, despite what the vendors will tell you, represent any kind of magic bullet solution. If any technology is to add benefit to your teaching or to your processes, it should meet the needs that you have in a genuine way. An additional recommendation we would have is that rather than trying to use 20 different Gen AI tools, try and find a tool that works with you for whatever purpose or whatever your context is, and stick with that for a while. An additional note just on the use of Gen AI tools for teaching is that there is a paper developed by our colleagues Laurie Phipps and Donna Langclose, who are adjunct faculty. They've identified that for many of the respondents, the research that they've engaged in this field is that the contribution of Gen AI tools is more to menial than cognitively complex and or challenging tasks. So in looking for yourselves to use particular Gen AI tools, it's maybe worth looking at maybe the more I suppose maybe looking at more administrative, more kind of basic, less kind of complex tasks to begin with, and trying to identify resources that can help with that. So talking about the use of Gen AI tools for learning, I suppose primarily what I'm talking about here is the use of Gen AI tools by students. Again, there's a broad range of research available, and that research would generally indicate that how students tend to use Gen AI tools for their purposes is in cleaning up their writing, formulating ideas, and brainstorming, generating initial answers from which they develop kind of assessments that they write in their own words or kind of, that they build upon. They use Gen AI tools for summarizing information, for providing feedback, and media generation, so development of images and other forms of media. Generally, research would indicate that they tend to rely on open tools such as ChatGPT. But I suppose an important consideration with all of that research is that it doesn't necessarily reflect actual usage of Gen AI for assessment content generation. So that research doesn't necessarily indicate the actual usage of tools like ChatGPT as a way of responding or submitting assessment work. There's some interesting research as to the whole area of when students do use tools like ChatGPT to submit assessment content. Generally, in that research indicates that there's two main stated variables: prior experience with AI and perceived allowability of AI use. So that does maybe go back to something which was mentioned earlier in terms of using tools like the AI assessment scales, that kind of what we communicate to students in terms of what we are happy for them to use for generative AI tools for assessment purposes, that does indeed actually seem to have an impact on the degree to which they will use those tools for in breach, I guess, of academic integrity. Additional kind of areas which have been identified as potentially useful use of Gen AI tools in learning relates to personalized learning, accessibility support, and AI-powered virtual assistants. Generally, research is light enough on current application of these levels. of these elements, excuse me. But then if we broaden the scope, we can look at tools like Grammarly, education-focused chatbots, which are currently in use today as some form of AI and AI use to support students. Something I'd like to talk a small bit about as well in the session is the potential impact of AI on the graduates that MTU is producing. So something which I would note from the get-go here is that a lot of the data sets which we look at or which are available in this space are primarily predictive. So generally data sets that I've referenced from this report, I've tried to focus on resources that are very recent or that present actual evidence-based data rather than papers which forecast information. But I would say in general, there's a huge amount of data out there, a huge amount of prediction out there in terms of the impact that GenAI tools will have on industry. So there is no definitive source, I would say, in terms of indicating what the impact will be. On that basis, it's just something, it's an area which we have to kind of continually return to and try and identify or engage with. There's also a number of data sources which have strong vested interests, like reports developed by the OpenAI Institute. So generally, there's a broad range of research which would indicate that 2024 was a very big year for the adoption of GenAI tools. There's a number of research reports which indicated that a lot of industry is using AI more and more substantially across a number of different ways. Generally, those research reports indicate that use of AI in industry is growing and is forecasted to grow. Use of multiple functions within organizations of GenAI tools is also growing. And there is also the levels of adoption seems to be strongest among IT and cybersecurity, marketing, sales, and customer service, and product development. Generally, the use of AI is most strongly related to productivity and standard applications. Equally, and I guess this is one of the difficulties with the whole space, there is data and research which would indicate that among a lot of industries, while there is use of AI, it is very limited and it is only used by a very small specific subgroup within various industries. So again, like with many elements to do with AI, there is kind of conflicting information in terms of the degree to which it is used in different spaces. An additional consideration when we talk about the impact that AI is going to have on the industry that our students are going to go out into, generally it would appear that kind of early career positions would be most at threat of automation through AI. So generally that would be primarily because those kind of entry-level positions, they're more commonly associated with tasks related to administration, basic content development, compliance. All of those are kind of our tasks which GenAI can do relatively well. So generally it would indicate that kind of entry-level positions are the ones most at risk in terms of automation. And an additional important consideration when we talk about AI, it can be very easy to fall into a habit of talking about it as this kind of ubiquitous technology, equally kind of talking about kind of the impact it will have on industry at large, talking about that as though it is the one thing, whereas the reality is lots of different kind of AI tools, lots of different industries. Their research would indicate that certain industries are far more at risk in terms of automation and job loss from GenAI tools than other ones. So, for example, industries which have been identified at risk of AI, most at risk of AI affecting employment include finance and industry, information and communication, insurance, media and entertainment. Industries who have been identified at least risk of AI affecting employment include spaces like tourism and hospitality, healthcare, engineering and construction, transport and storage, agriculture or forestry, and fishing. What this means for us, I think, in MTU is that it is important we try to develop an understanding ourselves of how AI will impact the industries we're sending graduates out into. So our own industries, developing an understanding not only of how to use or the impact that GenAI tools will have within the classroom and on the student experience, but also on the specific industries that we are producing graduates for. Some additional issues and impact, maybe just to mention briefly. I'm sure we're all familiar with the notion of hallucinations in generative AI tools like ChatGPT. I suppose an important consideration with kind of things like hallucinations is these are not aberrations. These are not accidents per se. These are kind of built in to the system. An important, I suppose, how I tend to look at these kind of elements in GenAI tools myself is very simply that ChatGPT and similar tools, they will never, ever, ever tell you, I don't know, if they don't know the answer to something. They'll simply try and fill in the gaps themselves. So, the issue of hallucinations is not something which is necessarily going to be resolved anytime soon, regardless of what many industries will say. Additionally, how most Gen AI tools tend to function is they're reliant on what's referred to as kind of clean or effective data, generally, which is gathered from the web. At the moment, there is a danger of that data running out. One solution to this is the notion that Gen AI systems, LLMs, could be fed and trained on synthetic data, so data which is developed by other um, large language models. The issue with that is feeding synthetic data into LLM can result in this system call, or in this feature called systems collapse, which is pretty much what it says in the tin, where kind of synthetic data being fed into a system which is producing synthetic data basically collapses the entire system. There's been a lot written around the kind of development, the ability of Gen AI tools to produce slop, which is kind of essentially kind of irrelevant, immaterial, incorrect content, and the notion that that could flood the internet. There is also existing research which indicates that there is no guarantee that generative AI tools and systems will actually improve. The nature of these systems is that they're somewhat of kind of blank boxes, even to the developers. So, for example, certain features of GPT 4.0 were less effective, or kind of were less than um, those same kind of functionalities in GPT 3.5. I suppose the point there is very simply that kind of there can be an assumption that kind of these tools will continue to improve as time goes on, but that is not necessarily a guarantee. Additional considerations then, which I think many of us would be aware of, but I think are important to mention, relate to ethical issues in the use of generative AI tools. So my intention is certainly not to kind of gloss over these, but it is, I think, important to mention them anytime we talk about generative AI tools, and that includes the impact, excuse me, the environmental impact of Gen AI tools, the exploitation of particularly workforces in developing countries to train these systems, issues around kind of intellectual property and copyright theft, bias, which is inherent in many Gen AI tools, and yeah, then kind of the ongoing issue around hallucinations and critical issues. Also, as well, the unforeseen impact of the use of Gen AI tools on, for example, the student population. There's existing research which indicates that there's a significant negative correlation between the frequent use of AI tools and critical thinking abilities. So, all of that said, I would like to maybe just mention, like, if anybody does have any questions or queries or comments, I would encourage you to please put them into the Q&A section. If you are with us here in Zoom, or alternatively to put it into the live chat if you're watching over YouTube. Just while you're doing that, I might just mention a couple of additional activities that the Department of TEL will be doing in this space over the coming semester. So something which I already mentioned is that the Department of TEL and our colleagues in Kerry EDSU are planning to do a closed pilot for AI detection feature in Turnitin over the coming semester. So what we'll be looking for is we will be looking for volunteers to engage in that process. And the intention there is to essentially try out this AI detection feature to determine the effectiveness, the limitations of it, and to try collectively as a university to see if this is something which would offer, I suppose, more positives than negatives in usage within MTU. Additionally, we in the Department of TEL will be rolling out both live and asynchronous AI literacy training to academic staff and students. And in particular, that will be focusing on the potential impact of GenAI tools within the MTU digital learning system. So that's something that we'll be looking to provide over the coming semester as well. And finally, we will be hosting in the Department of TEL a series of GenAI seminars for MTU staff. And what we will be doing is we will be getting in a number of highly established and reputable guest speakers, including Professor Moray Bachka, who is the author of the 2024 book Generative AI in Education, and Professor Richard Watermeyer, among others. So we'll be looking to bring in a number of external experts to speak to MTU staff and students about GenAI and the impact it will have on education over the coming years. Just a couple of final considerations, which I would encourage you to maybe reflect upon. If you are interested in using GenAI tools within your own teaching, what I would suggest is starting small and ring fencing usage. And what is important as well is that, if you are using any GenAI tool, what is important is that you receive some genuine benefit from it. There can be a habit of taking up a tool and, even though a tool may be touted as being extremely effective or extremely beneficial, what can very often happen is that you can end up just making more work for yourself. So I would suggest starting small and ring fencing usage, focusing on using a tool for one very specific purpose and seeing what benefits that brings you. I would say as well, consider task and outcome as two separate things. Very often a GenAI tool can maybe save you some small short-term work, but it can lead to a negative outcome. And I suppose what I tend to think of are all those ChatGPT lawyers who save themselves a bit of time in kind of getting ChatGPT to develop use cases or kind of existing examples, but who ultimately were fired because the outcome indicated or kind of the outcome was that they were found out in court as having completely fabricated things. Additionally, be aware that kind of to use these kind of tools effectively, very often there might be some work required in terms of better understanding things like prompt engineering. I would suggest as well that critical analysis is essential for anybody using any of these tools. I would say consider assessment as a short-term critical issue when it comes to GenAI tools. Like I said earlier, this doesn't mean that you need to go away and you need to immediately redesign 100% of all your assessments, but there are immediate and effective actions you can take in the use of things like the AI scale, the use of rubrics, adjusting the process as opposed to having to redevelop assessments from scratch. I would say try and become your own authority. You don't need to know everything about the technology, but what is important, I think, is that we all develop an understanding of how it will affect our own areas. I think an important element relating to that is speaking to colleagues, speaking to students, and sharing best practice. I think that the very often the most effective and the most practical and the most insightful information comes from within our own organization, and I think that will definitely be true for MTU. I would say as well, don't ever not talk about the dark side. So I think we do have an obligation and a responsibility to ensure that students also understand the elements like the environmental, ethical, and IP impact related with the use of GenAI tools. And obviously that is relevant not just for students. So if I may, I'd like to just look at some of the questions that people have put into the Q&A session, and thanks for your patience in terms of me getting to these. So in terms of the AI literacy sessions, so what they will primarily focus on, I think, is just a better understanding of kind of the technologies and the kind of resources that are going to be available and how these can impact educators. I suppose kind of certainly the session today was an attempt to just provide some, practical common sense consideration in terms of the use of GenAI tools and kind of both from an assessment and from a teaching and from a learning perspective. So the AI literacy sessions will focus more on that. We'll be hoping to make them available both as asynchronous resources, but also as live training sessions. So we'll be providing additional information on that over the coming weeks. Another person in Zoom asks, at present, it seems to be an individual lecture choice as to how much they officially permit or talk about AI, and this must be confusing for students. And yeah, I don't disagree at all. Generally, I suppose the difficulty, I think, with the use of GenAI tools or kind of developing policy around GenAI is that, much like the use of, I suppose, existing kind of available technology, excuse me, um, some lecturers some lecturers are very effective in using kind of a broad range of technology as a means to support or enhance their learning or their teaching. Other lecturers are able to, are more comfortable in not using kind of available technologies or kind of using minimal amounts of technology to accomplish their teaching. So I do think it is confusing for students, but equally, I think there is a danger in trying to impose a limit, as in you must use, Gen AI tools for this and this for your teaching. You can't use it for this and this. I think it would also be difficult and confusing in trying to establish, I suppose, a baseline use of tools like Gen AI for teaching purposes. So in that instance, it is an individual choice for lecturers. I don't think that there is necessarily a better solution, or at least one that could be, worth doing without creating kind of additional chaos or additional kind of challenges. Um, what I would suggest is kind of like some of the elements that I mentioned in the sessions earlier around kind of the use of a common AI assessment scale, I think would be very useful. So kind of having an agreed scale that is used across, that is made available to all staff and that all staff can kind of reference. I think something kind of shared resources like that, I think would be very useful as a way of trying to keep things consistent for students, but also giving individual lecturers the freedom to decide how much or how little Gen AI tools they want to use with students. Hopefully that makes some kind of sense. It's, I suppose, not something which is easily answered because there is a balancing act there between what is fair on staff and what is consistent for students. So those are all the questions which emerged during Zoom. I can see that there aren't any questions on YouTube. Something just to mention is that there are some additional resources which we've identified there, which we found to be generally quite good, with a view to kind of Gen AI at a general level. There are also a number of references that I used in the presentation, so I can make those available to anyone who is interested also. Beyond that, I think we've answered all of the questions, so all that's left to do is really just to say thanks so much, everyone, for coming along to the session. And as I mentioned, this is just one of a number of sessions and activities and initiatives that the Department of TEL will be providing over the coming semester with a view to generative AI. So we will be announcing more initiatives over the coming weeks, and hope that that was of some use and that you'll be able to come along to the future ones also. In general, I guess this is kind of a constantly emerging and rapidly changing area, but we will do our best to try and provide as much guidance as we can in this space. So with that in mind, just thanks very much, everyone, for your time and attention, and hope to see you again. So thank you.